devoted to our work on the Every Student Succeeds Act. Currently present are at-large member Ashley Carter, Ruth Wambler from Ward 3, Joe Whedon from Ward 6, and myself, Jack Jacobson from Ward 2, as well as Lynette Woodruff from Ward 4. With that, I don't want to give a big preamble. I'll turn it over to Ruth if she'd like to say something briefly, and then I'd love to really get to the Q&A with OSSE.
No, the only thing I want to say is that we've conveyed to OSSE a large number of questions that we need answers to understand how we're proceeding on this, and we look forward to working with you to understand the next one.
So we have a couple of things for you today. Thank you for sending the questions in advance. We've taken a look through and sort of tried to pull some similar themes. And so what we were proposing to do is sort of talk through the larger buckets of content that are cited by a lot of the questions here in sort of thematic or programmatic chunks. And then we do have a couple of broad updates that we can also share if we have time towards the end, with a couple of other sort of technical updates in other provisions that we've been working on, if that works.
What time are we ending? Or are you
You can keep going. Karen and I just after 5 o'clock.
Okay.
So,
well, I mean, I think we were going to try and definitely be here till 5:30, and then.
Well, and I also want to say thank you once again. This is a special meeting. We requested it, and OSSE was good enough to accommodate that request, and that's appreciated by all board members.
Thank you. Was there anything else that over here, Chelsea, that you wanted to highlight? Okay, great. So one of the big themes that I know we've talked about before and that are covered in a bunch of these questions are growth, and in a variety of different ways. So we thought I'd first talk a little bit specifically of a couple of the different themes of questions around growth in these sets of questions. One was a specific question about the second proposed growth metric in the framework, which is essentially a growth to proficiency style measure, which is based on a more absolute instead of norm-based growth. So you had asked specifically about the methodology, or what it means, what it means, and how it's different than the other type of growth metric. So the primary growth metric currently used is MGP, which is a median growth percentile, which is a measure of on average how much students learned above the average. And so the average for the city in any year, no matter how much or little students learn in any year, is 50, and schools range above and below that, depending on how much they outperformed or underperformed the average of the city. And so that is helpful in a number of ways, but it's not the only way to measure growth, and it only captures certain kinds of things in that growth. So if everybody does really well one year, there's still going to be certain schools who are under the average, and if everybody does very poorly, there's still going to be a bunch of people over the average. And
can I interrupt one question? My understanding of the MGP, this is right, is that you're compared to students like you in the sense of what they scored last year. So it's not everybody to a single city average, it's everybody to sort of their own group average. Okay.
Yes, it's based on individual student scores, but philosophically that's how a model works.
Yeah, there's 2 steps to it. So you do the student growth percentile. That's based on exactly what you just said, Ruth, like how other students who had similar performance to you last year did, and then how you did the following year, and then a school, all of their SGPs get rolled up into the MGP, and that becomes the school level score.
So one thing we did consider in looking at our framework is, are there other ways of measuring growth that could be meaningful and giving a fuller picture of what growth means at a school? And instead of using using a norm reference measure, this is a standard reference measure, which is to say, if given a student's performance on the assessment and their level of readiness at one time, how much would they have to grow to be college and career ready? And how much growth would they have to make at intervals in order to get there? And then you measure how, if a student did make enough progress to be on track over time to get to proficient or ready. And what that measures is really a focus on the students who are further behind, but in a way that says, how are schools actually not just growing in general, but how are they actually helping those students furthest behind actually be on track? It's a much harder target to reach, obviously, and I think that it wouldn't be anyone's choice as a single growth measure for a school, but it is very rarely a choice that states or other accountability systems make, but it does show us important information as a way of focusing on how we are actually making progress towards an actual target of getting students ready. So that is part of the growth portfolio in our framework. So we wanted to share that specific sort of business rule around that in a way that I think is a little clearer, and what shows like both why we would choose to have two different kinds of growth, because they show slightly different things, and they're both important.
Sorry, I'm just going to give like a specific example. So if you have a kid who started at level 1, you're saying in 3 years we want that kid to close the gap to level 4 by 1/3 in a year. So long as the kid makes progress 1/3 of the way to level 4, they get sort of like full credit in terms of the measure. So it's not saying someone has to go from 1 to 4 in a year. It's saying, are you making progress in the projected trajectory so that in a reasonable amount of time you would get there, rather than just saying, did your school grow? And did they grow relative to how well the city either did or didn't grow?
So if the student is moving from level, like normally it's level 1 to level 2 to level 3 to 4, this is giving credit to the student for making growth in between those levels. So incremental growth gets points, gets credit along the trajectory, both like in between the level 1 to 2, like student makes the growth from here to here, or makes this much progress in like 2 years, they get points. Or you can set the targets further out so that they like cut the gap. So it's points towards gap closure and also points towards incremental growth.
And unlike some other measures that we looked at for growth, it's not based on just kids on the edges in terms of bubble pit, right? So that was one of the reasons why we liked this measure better than some other options as well, that really only teetered on like, well, who did you have, sort of threshold-wise that was right on the edge that you could bring over. This looked more at the spectrum of where kids could be and gave them credit for moving an endpoint.
Should we pop any questions, or do you want to go over it?
There's a couple of other ones that might be quicker in this sort
Yeah,
of broader growth
growth
bucket too. So the other thing is folks talked about how students are used for a full school year in a growth measure. And there's a business rule called full academic year, which is applied for students in any school, which says that you're only going to use, for the purpose of accountability, the scores of students who have been there for a full academic year, which is usually a certain high percentage of the school year. I think it's
80% threshold or something.
percent of enrollment days at the school. So those students would still be tested, and they would receive the outcomes of their scores, and it would be reported at the statewide average, but a school is not going to be, it would not have included their score for accountability. So that's for assessments, for the assessment part of the accountability system.
In that case, have we thought about how scores may be affected in relation to students who miss an extended period of the school year, where they may have been enrolled but were suspended or displaced or had to take a large leave of absence?
This full academic year business rule will take that into account.
Well, it takes into account enrollment. It doesn't take into account extended absence that while the student is enrolled.
Right.
So, which would be another reason why there is focus on attendance measures and other things to encourage that, students learn when they are in school. And so, but it is an enrollment measure, not an attendance-based measure.
And part of that is the reason too, like even in the instance in which the student isn't test the student or the school or the student as well. We still want them to test and we still want those scores to come back so that there is some information about it, but then not counted towards the school.
And neither did proficiency with growth.
Correct.
For any assessment bucket, you're
It's
not,
counted towards participation.
it's counted, but it's not counted
And
towards.
so if I'm a student who's 50% in one school and 50% in another school, I don't get counted on anybody's.
You get it from the states, but
not
not
on
for the school.
Potentially the LEAs, depending on what schools you.
But that's not the same as the accountability for the school.
Well, so far, we haven't been presented with anything that's
There's,
over.
Yeah, there's
just
no
in terms of like
reporting.
reporting of results.
So, and then finally, there were a couple of questions about high school, so I just wanted to include those because broadly they're sort of in the assessments and growth bucket. And they were largely, there's one question about 8th to 9th and 9th to 10th ELA. So there's a couple of answers to this question. First is, yes, it is technically possible to measure growth in ELA from an elementary to a high school level. For either English or math, we have not yet had enough years of data to do that growth measurement and won't until next year because of the trajectory of students to have to progress a certain number of years through the system to take it in 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, and moving forward. So we will have enough data to collect it and run numbers in a year.
Yeah, so we ran it, we did PART for the first time in 14-15, so like a kid would have been in 7th grade. We then did it in 15-16, that kid is in 8th grade. This year, oh wait, did I say the year?
8th, 9th, 10th.
Started the year early.
Started the year early.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. My example is making sense. 14, 15th, and 8th grade. 15, 16, they were 9th grade. They didn't take a test. This year, they're now taking the test in 10th grade, and that's the most common sequence in terms of either if a student is taking English, taking 8th grade English, and then English 2 in 10th grade, or if they're taking 8th grade math, and then geometry, which is the most commonly taken in 10th grade. So this spring will be the first time that we have kids who have actually followed.
So you need enough data to actually do the math to calculate it.
So for a year out, we could do a growth score from 8 to 10.
So, yeah, so there's a couple other nuances and I'll give you the fuller picture to that, right? So that's the first part, is just a flat timing issue. Second is, there's some technical challenges that we have to have the data in order to figure out, which is about volume of high schoolers taking these assessments and when, to make sure that if we could model that it would work, especially in the math side, as there's course-based assessments, and how when we begin to model this, how it might affect schools with different course configurations, and if we could have a model that is strong enough between the most commonly and highest volume test takers. And that is work that we are really interested in doing, and we just don't know the answers yet as to what it will look like to run the models, but we are planning on doing it.
I want to caution a little bit about the most common path in a school. By doing that, we're eliminating the highest performing math students.
No, this is exactly my point actually, right? Which is we wouldn't have a growth measure that we may end up being able to actually technically calculate something, but then it wouldn't be applicable to some schools who have pathways like that. And that is another thing we're looking to figure out actually. It's exactly what you're saying. Like, there's clearly always going to be multiple pathways of curricula, and if we may be able to technically calculate a growth measure, but it only applies to a certain number of schools, and so it really wouldn't necessarily be worth it. That being said, the second question that was asked here about PSAT, SAT is also on the table. Sorry.
So Lynette's question.
Oh, Lynette's one, sorry. They weren't labeled.
Yeah.
It is also on the table to explore. And so all of these different parts, Park Elementary, Park High School, PSAT, SAT, and the matrix between them are on the table to examine. I think there's broad interest, including OSSE interest, in a high school growth measure, but we don't actually have one now, and we need to do more research to figure out, and intend to do more research to figure out what is possible and makes the most sense for the most schools in a way that will be helpful for all the different kinds of schools we have.
Just one question. you're saying it is on the table, are you saying it's on the table for inclusion in this go-round?
The PSAT specifically, or
But-
just in
but-
general? Okay.
Well, no, we can't include it because it doesn't exist. So
The PSAT, SAT, or the?
Yeah.
No, neither, because the SAT is new, the psychometrics behind those two are yet to be modeled, and yet to be modeled here. Lots of business rules about who does take it, if you have to take it, and multiple other things. So we couldn't include it now because it just doesn't, those models don't exist yet. There's multiple other states and other places looking into this as well, and so we're hoping to leverage sort of like the broader momentum towards finding some of these out, but we're also still invested in Park as well to see what is viable. But we couldn't include it because it doesn't exist now. We very much want to.
And this goes back, particularly for our new board members, to when Park was implemented citywide. We did a 1 year hold harmless through the waiver for schools because we had to have a year of data to norm the assessment, and then start putting stakes behind it. So we did that. There's precedent for that, and that's the only way that you really can do something like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are as committed as anyone could be to having one or if not both of these work out. It's just a timing and psychometric challenge where we have to have the data, and we're in regular communication with College Board now to start learning about what's possible, and like sort of our questions are creating the pace at which like they're working and thinking through it, which is helpful in some senses because you're shaping the work, but not in the sense that we can't just plug into something that already exists.
And are you saying, is it your position that also with the park that it can't be done this year, or that's something you're still working on to see with the current data?
It can't be done because we don't have the data.
But shouldn't that be part of the proposal, is that you're gonna have the data and then you're gonna work it, or
No, because we're just not sure, even if we have the data, that it would work for a couple of the reasons that Joe mentioned, as well as others about.
Yeah, based on what we've seen. Based on what we've seen with the middle school data, like currently where we have multiple pathways in math, there are challenges there. So right now, for schools that have students who take 7th grade math and then take Algebra 1, we haven't had large enough N size to be able to do MGP for those kids. We were able to do this other growth measure, which is great news, but based on that information, it makes us hesitant to say what might be possible for high school without playing out the data and building that into a system without knowing the potential unknowns of what that does for particular schools just feels very irresponsible, frankly, if we haven't been able to model it.
I have a question in regards to data. You're speaking of math, but in literacy, and that's pretty across the board. Do we not have a way to start off with literacy? That way we can start the process and just become comfortable that everybody understands that on the pathway math will happen for that. But for right now, we know that all high school students are taking literacy, and can we use the partner literacy as starting point?
I think this is actually where we run into just the timing factor, in that because this is going to be this year will be the first year. We just haven't received enough to do it, and we won't have until the end of the school year. And I think we are open to considering what it might look like, but we didn't want to build a system around it right now, given that it's easier to sort of put it in the wait till we get it and do the model and make sure it feels appropriate and safe before we move forward. And in that sense, that's where the timing issue actually comes in.
So, well, we can come back. I think we want to probably push you on that, about the timing issue, because it's important, and maybe that means we would wait till October, or maybe there's a way to put it in the proposal with some caveats about trying it out. But I don't want to take time now, but I would think there might be ways that could go in. But
Or at least a very clear statement that in year 2, this will be incorporated, assuming X, Y, and Z is met.
I think we're definitely interested in ways that we can communicate how interested we are in high school growth. So, there's lots of interest across schools and across communities about what that could look like too, so I think we wanna have some of those conversations. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, that is one bucket as we will growth. Another set of themes that we noticed through here is a couple of really substantive questions about how subgroups are used in calculations and protections against different kinds of unintended consequences. And so I thought I'd start by answering a couple of those technical questions, and we may seed into some of the more other philosophical ones. Jesse, I'm trying to figure out if we can pull up a couple of the slides. Yeah.
So do you want the one that has the thing on the bottom?
No, that's okay. Let's start here.
Okay,
Do you want to give them a full?
Okay.
I'm sorry, which slide is that? I'm trying to do WebEx at the same time.
23, sorry.
Okay, so one of the things that we've shared before is that one of the values we find important is including both the outcomes of all students and of specific groups of students in calculating the score. And there were a couple of specific scores, questions about, you know, in using this transparency, how are we both able to show the outcomes of these students and also not either penalize schools or hide, for lack, you know, a more elegant word, or that they be, you know, obscured the outcomes of certain groups of students in any given school. So we thought the most effective way to do this, and we don't have to spend a ton of time, is to go through again, because we did a lot of data all at once last time, the proposed framework first, and how we think those protections are included. And then if we might also start to seek into some of the other sets of questions about how and why we focus on specific groups of students and those furthest behind. But I think they're slightly different questions, so we just start with like the technical response.
Yeah, so first, in all the boxes you're seeing here, the data would be publicly displayed for all. What ends up coming into play when we talk about some of the technical business rules is how the ultimate calculation takes place for an accountability score. So I just wanted to point out there's sort of a layer of public transparency for all subgroups, and then there's the how subgroups and all students factor into an overall accountability score. And so when we're talking about the overall accountability score, what we're having done is for a school, for all of our metrics, we're running that framework as if first all of the kids that are currently present are in that school, and then we're running the framework based on specific groups of students only. So taking the whole framework and running that for Black students, taking the whole framework, running that for economically disadvantaged students. But as you can imagine, when you do that, not every school has every subgroup, and not every school has enough kids in every subgroup to meet the minimum N size. And so if a school meets minimum N size for a particular group of students for a particular measure, then that framework, that measure can be calculated. However, a measure individually being calculated is not the same as a whole framework being calculated. So when we've talked about, you know, a middle school framework, it has, you know, a measure of growth, a measure of 4+, 3+, attendance, and so forth. So it's possible that a school may have enough students to calculate a measure, but not enough to calculate a whole framework. And when we looked at data from year over year, we saw there are sometimes fluctuations, but there aren't usually from one year to another such a fluctuation that a school is going from 10 to 11, and that might, you know, we're worried that that's going to influence practices. Well, in this case, we can still calculate the measure, but the overall framework wouldn't be calculated unless enough measures had substantial enough points. So in the scenario we're talking about here, in this school, there weren't enough students in all of the groups that are grayed out to count towards a school's final score. So there weren't enough kids to have sufficient points for enough measures for the whole framework to be calculated. So bear with the details here, because it will make sense if we can talk through the chart a bit. So if we have a school that has mostly African American students and economically disadvantaged and special education students, and they have a few students who are Hispanic and very few kids who are Asian, English learners, or white students, it means that there may be some measures for those groups that are calculated, but that they didn't have enough kids for enough measures for the whole framework to be calculated. So there's still transparency around how their Hispanic students did for attendance, but because they didn't actually have enough Hispanic students for both the attendance measure and the park-related measures, they're not going to have a framework that's calculated overall just based on attendance, because that doesn't actually make sense. So it balances this transparency and honesty about the groups of students that they're serving, but it doesn't unfairly hold them accountable for a group beyond what is reasonable given their current student population.
And so I think this is like the root of one of the questions, which is like swings in students up and down, changing things. This, because you have to add up in enough of the measures, what that means is there's gonna have to be a critical mass of students big enough that it's not like 4 to 5, 10 to 11, and that helps stabilize the system a little bit for most schools in which that would be a concern.
And we found that this was a more stabilizing force than something like bringing up the end size threshold, because this allowed public reporting and greater transparency while balancing fairness and stability of the system year over year.
Yeah, other folks do, like in other contexts or other states, there is just that trend towards just like increasing the end size. And we really didn't want to do that for a variety of reasons that we all, I think, broadly agree on. So this was a compromise. Well, a creative, I guess, not so much compromise,
So,
but.
I have a question, and if it's not easily answerable, we can delay it to later, but as I'm understanding it, which may be wrong, it seems like if I'm a school, let's say I'm a school, I have a lot of Hispanic students, and maybe I have a lot of ELL, but let's say they're all low scoring. It seems to me that they're not gonna, between the fact that there's a lot of them, but it's not a majority, right? Between the fact that there's not that many of them and that the scores are low, they're not going to show up where you have part 3 plus, part 4 plus, and the MGP won't be very high. In other words, all those numbers under possible points will be very low because their scores are low.
No.
Or failing.
This, it means,
It has nothing to do with their actual performance.
this just means not like how many points you score, but how many points you are eligible to score. And so, you could score 1 out of 12.5 part 4 plus, and as long as you had enough students to qualify to show
So
part.
it just means that I have an N size,
Yeah.
that the N size of 10 that potentially could earn the part 4.
Yeah, it doesn't have to do with the number of points, but the reason why the number of points is important is
Yeah,
Is
and
that N at a grade level or across the school level?
it's at the school.
At the school?
well,
Yeah.
it's at the school for the school reporting. If we would suppress files for grades if and when we had to report them at the grade level, but for the accountability level, it's for the school.
And Ruth, the reason why it could be slightly different, remember when we were just talking about FAY rules for assessment? So you could be a Hispanic student in a school, but you may not have been there for enough days to meet the threshold to count for reporting, but for reporting for accountability results for the assessment. But if you were still present for, I think the attendance rule is like 10 days or something, like you could still count towards attendance. So you could be a student who's present in a school who belongs to a specific group, but who doesn't meet the threshold for one measure versus another.
Yeah, or another good example of that is like students in untested grades. You could have a
Yeah.
large population, but they'd be distributed enough across the tested grades that they wouldn't show up, but they're in like your early elementary grades, and so therefore they qualify for lots of measures, but maybe not the part measures or something like that.
Yeah, so this is just showing what I walked through, which was, while there were Hispanic students in the school, because only the 2 attendance measures could be calculated, that's not enough for the whole framework to be calculated, so this one drops out. So in the case of this school, we're only basing it on their populations, that they not only had enough ends to run individual measures, but that they had sufficient points overall in the framework to have a fully reasonable framework to include for the calculation.
Yeah, and just to be clear, those students never drop out of the all students score.
Correct.
So all the students who are eligible for any measure always count in all students. It just wouldn't be broken out or highlighted. So,
I was gonna say, so you said that data would be highlighted, but internally, will OSSE still have that information? Because even if there were, only 10 African American students at a school, do you still have the information on how well that school is serving that small population of African American students?
we do, and the school would.
Yeah.
I mean, largely at that point, there's certain rules that we would have about publishing it that have to do with student privacy
Right.
actually at that point, more than others.
Yeah.
So we do various kinds of trend analysis, and all the schools and LEAs themselves have their own, for sure. We just, at that point, we wouldn't publish in any of our public data numbers much less than 10, less than 10. Yeah,
Gotcha.
for sure. Okay. That's a technical piece.
Yeah. So technical.
Just to,
Yeah,
before we get out of
please.
the issue of the growth and the progress. So let me just say this, I think on behalf of pretty much everybody, our concern with the 50-50 split between proficiency and growth is that the students who are in a low scoring school, probably a high poverty school, and all the students are here, largely there, versus a high scoring school that's here. For these kids to reach proficiency, which requires this. For these kids to reach proficiency requires a huge growth. So insofar as we're just measuring, giving points based on proficiency, these schools are real, they could be greatly improving and they're not getting points, right? That's the issue, we all understand that, right? So one concern I have is if you do the growth to proficiency as part of growth, it seems like it might exacerbate that in some ways, in the sense that, well, compared to a regular growth score, right? Like if in a regular growth score, I mean, regular being a truly technical term, right?
Mhm.
But if I grew this much, let's say I get that much points, right? So I'm getting points. But if I'm down here and on my growth to projector growth to proficiency, I have to get there to get my points, I would be further disadvantaged. So how does
yeah,
that
that's
work?
I think it's a good point. There's a couple of things that I think that we would do to address that. So, you want to go ahead?
I think it's in the naming of the proficiency piece that is and if it was a straight growth proficiency, I can see what you're saying is true. Like it was literally, you only get points if you become proficient. But that's in the way that we described what the growth.
You know, right, you don't have to be proficient, but you have to move up that
You
trajectory
have to move
faster.
up at all.
No,
You
okay.
move up. If you
So-
move up, you get points.
so part of this
And
is
not
the
fewer
technical.
points because I have a longer way to go.
Well, no, so
Like the old AYP was sort of unfair. that way,
right.
but
So the way generally, and I can find better technical terms, but in some senses, in philosophy, that is correct. But what we want to do, but what we want to do is incentivize schools to focus on the students farthest behind and give credit where people are making strides that are actually meeting high enough, which with urgency and with actual, high enough growth to actually lead, not just to grow a little every year, but to grow to the point at which we want our students to be, to be able to know and demonstrate the skills that they need to learn and grow and be successful. And so what we do is in part here in the target setting. So we understand that if we set the target in 3 years, everybody has to get there, and if you don't meet that target, then you get no points, then yes, everybody would fail. pretty much, because it's really hard. But what you do is you look at at essentially how folks are doing, and you give folks credit for getting more and more and more students there. So you're saying, you've gotten X percent of your students are actually on track for getting that trajectory. We know it's like really, really hard to do all. We want everybody to do all, but it's hard. And so you get points for a sort of like a shifted scale as you're achieving more and more towards getting those kids the learning that they need every year. So it is accounted for in some of the standard setting and in the target setting that a school needs to be able to achieve to get the points for that, which is really, in some ways, giving some of the schools that are making the most growth the credit that they deserve, because they are getting extra credit for actually helping students grow the most when they're the furthest behind.
So why is it necessary that it's a 50-50 split? I don't understand that. Why is it, we know that we're gonna have a population that are gonna be +4s, and that almost the whole school may be that. But there are schools that are gonna be 1s and 2s, and like you're saying, those schools will not have that at what, 135, whatever points. Immediately, we know that they'll be discouraged, they won't have it. So how do we address that? Because it's like we're already putting them at a deficit because the reach is so far, And so why couldn't it be where you have I don't know, 35% for them, 45 for the other? It seems like in the district, if we're talking about, I hate using the word closing the achievement gap, because I believe the most important thing is everybody's growing. So we're not worried about a gap, because if everything's growing, the gap will slowly disappear. But if we don't focus on the fact that we have all this growth going on, we could set a pathway for the United States to see how important it is to look at things a little bit differently than just than a test. Because there are some schools now that the most important thing is everybody's got to get a 4 because we want that score. That's a BAM score. We got this. But there are some schools that are saying, oh my gosh, we want that BAM too, but that's not where our children are. And they will not have as much opportunity in points wise, even though they're growing, because it's weighted the same. So is there a rational, give me a rational why it's weighted like that, or is it something we could visit or we run the numbers?
Yeah, and I know we've talked about this a lot, so I can sort of say what.
But the question remains for all of us, so we can do it again.
Yes, so as I was gonna say, I think that it is largely a question of balancing the exact philosophy you're talking about and the philosophy that it is important to measure growth, and we have a lot of growth in a lot of different ways here, and it is also important to measure and hold people with urgency to a target that does measure that our children are actually growing to actually achieve at the levels that we know that we want them to and need them to, and to get credit when they've been able to provide that education and students have been able to learn and demonstrate that they can meet the skills that they need in the target that we know they need to be successful, in the most successful they can be. And so it is a balance, and in what is represented here is that is a philosophy that both are important, and that schools should be celebrated and have credit where they are meeting, where their students have been able to meet a 4+ target, which is sort of the college career ready / proficient, and even when they're not quite but approaching in the 3+, which is even different than many other places in the past when that wouldn't have even been included or considered. And that And that both are important. They're in attention. They are in attention with one another to say growing is important, but getting to the point of achievement is also important. And families care about both, and we have heard from many people, and we've acknowledged there's a spectrum of opinions on it, but families do care that their children achieve or are growing to the point that they can show this achievement as well. And it is a challenge, and we have schools at all levels of the spectrum who have been able to meet it. There are more hurdles for many of our students and many of our schools, but we have seen outcomes in which students have been able to achieve this and meet these levels of achievement. And so to show them both in that tension of both growth and getting and reaching that bar is important to us. And I say that acknowledging that, like you said, there's a tension, right?
There is, and I think part of what makes me constantly think about this is that I have 2 children in the system. As a child that thought to be gifted and talented on the charts, and of course they go gifted and talented DC, so you have to find specialty schools. The reason why the specialty school she's at is the one I chose was because I saw that they weren't just pushing her through because she understood stuff and they knew she was smart enough to get it. I chose the specialty school because I knew they were growing their children. That was the difference for me as a parent. And because you may be a high-performing school does not mean that you're growing your children. And that's just as important to measure to me as a low-performing school that is growing your children. Because the high-performing school that's growing your children needs to be applauded just as much as the low-performing school that is growing your children. The high-performing school that is sailing, someone needs to tap them and say, hey, wait a minute.
I want to echo that. There are a couple of schools that I know pretty well, and I've seen the data where you've got 2 groups of kids, the low-performing students, and they're rising well. You've also got this group of higher-performing students who are pretty much level. So are we measuring in some way or capturing whether or not these high-performing students are growing as well? I think that's something that we should be grading our schools on. Not just are they getting everybody up to the bar, level 3, level 4, wherever we want to set it, but do all students grow? And does what we're proposing accomplish that?
I think it does in that case through the more traditional median growth percentile growth measure, explicitly, because it does show growth for all students based on the students similar to them whose scores were like theirs last year. So, so in that case, you may well show that, but it's absolutely a point well taken, and it is part of that balance as well.
Students who perform similar to them in that school or citywide, where does that come from?
Citywide.
Before we continue, I do have a couple people on the phone, so please remember to speak up as much as you can. Your chat. We have Laura is on the phone, and Mark is going to be calling in soon.
Oh, I'm sorry. I appreciate what you all are doing. Thank you. I guess I'm looking at things from the perspective of having children in the system right now. And it's been a long walk in the DCPS system, but I've also worked in what I've seen is so much disparity from Ward 8 to Ward 1 to Ward 4. And one of the things we don't want to do is to put something in place that is not reachable. That's what No Child Left Behind was. And so that's why I question the score, how we're looking at our parks exam. It's very, very important, but it doesn't have to end all be on. And so when we're question is, why is there not a category that actually looks at, we say we wanna look at, sorry, my brain is challenged now, but,
She's been really sick.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that's
She
right.
is sick
We
right now.
appreciate you being here.
The challenge is that there are schools that are growing their children because there's a category that we don't have listed here that looks at what is affordable or available to that school. So, what's the word I'm looking for? It's one of the
Resources?
What is the resources, which makes them able to get things done. So if a school is performing high, but they're low performing, they're low school,
Yeah.
but they're moving their children, it might be because equity. They might have spent their money to make sure that they have a tutor for the children that need literacy. So through all our measurements, are we really taking an opportunity to make sure that we're looking at that? Because that type of equity is so important. That high functioning school, like you were talking to, those children that are right here, they may be right here because the school's not spending the money to bring in a reading specialist. Or they're not spending the money to bring in someone who teaches robotics to your most gifted kids at that school. But that's what helps you grow. And so there's a category that has a listing of knowing what the schools are doing equity-wise to reach the goal with growth. Because you can't grow unless you're doing something.
Yeah.
And if you're high performing and they're coming in smart already, they're gonna be smart when it comes to the test. But are you growing them? Because they're gonna leave us, go to college, and they're still gonna fail. Because they're not gonna be able to see, because we didn't give them that well-rounded education that we should have here in the District of Columbia. And we have more children here that have not been exposed to the simple things. And are we measuring that kind of stuff? Are we measuring the field trip? We took a field trip of children from Ward 8. We thought they were looking at the statue of Beverly. The parents got on the bus with us and had never been to a farm. Those are the kind of things that that schools that begin to expose their children to that. But it comes time to these standardized tests and everything else that the children are asked to accomplish in science and math. And it can be done.
So I'm hoping you can wrap up. Karen has something, and
No,
I think
I was just going to I'm piggyback on what you're saying because it's the environment. Is what you're saying. It's the school environment. What services and resources are available in the lower performing schools to give the children the experiences they need to grow, not only to pass the test. And I think that says it in a nutshell. Okay. So that's what however you grade them and whatever weights, if you don't give the support services to the schools that need them, they're not going to succeed. And I know, I'm not saying how you bundle that into the package, but it's climate, which a lot of people have said should be indicator. So is climate something that we can consider as an indicator or not?
Yeah, so thank you, Lynette and Karen. I think what you're saying is very resonant both for us and for everybody we talk to. And so I think there's a lot of places to go with that. I think there's definitely a giant bucket of questions here about non-academic measures, so we should make sure we have time when everybody who doesn't have to leave, we can talk about that. I do want to say, like, in terms of equity and resources to schools, this is also very important, and there have been, if they are still upheld and, the center holds, some new requirements for schools about funding reporting, which are going to be a technical but important way of exposing some of that information that you're talking about, Lynette, in terms of LEAs and schools and the state and the way funding is distributed by school. by school for, personnel, non-personnel costs by source, local and federal. So this is it's a very new frontier for most of our schools, and it is required to be the same formula across the city and across the state, and across schools. And so, it's still, a year and a half or so out in terms of when it will be implemented, but it is in the regs right now to say, what and how this funding is being used, and what are the equities or inequities in the way our schools are resourced, in spending that funding. And again, unfortunately, I'm sure once we see the numbers, they won't be exactly black and white. There will be lots of stories in them, but it is something that we anticipate being part of the conversation moving forward in that way, at least the kind of thing that we're gonna be involved in having to report publicly and share. But I think, so let's spend a little bit of time on,
Before you go to the others, first, Marcus has a question, but still on the progress, and I have one last thing on the progress.
Well, I'm assuming we're about to move to something, so I can wait.
All right, so here's my question, which I think ties a lot of this together, and we put it here, and we've talked about it, which is, if the goal is, our concern, as I say, is we don't want to identify as failing schools that start out low scoring, make great progress, but don't hit a 3, right? Our we have a lot of concerns, but a huge one would be schools with low scoring kids at the beginning of the year who do a good job of growth, sort of better than average, right? They should not end up with a low score because of their low proficiency rates. If they did a great job growing, they need to be credited with that. So I think a lot of this, it's really, what does it look like when you do the models, right? We can go back and forth on the numbers and the weights and the this and the that. Have you guys run some models so that we can look at how that kind of school would do? Because I think ultimately that's what it comes down to.
I think our intent is the same as yours, although I think the devil's in the details of names and numbers and low and high. But yeah, I think that is our intent here. That is, we reward schools that are growing, and that even if you are, if most of your students are not at an achievement level, that you are getting enough credit for the fact that they are growing in a strong way, that you are not, unless pending all the rest of the measures and other things, that you are getting credit for that as in the level and the ranking of your school. The system
That you would not get a low ranking, that's what
So I think I hesitate to say not get a low ranking, because I don't know what that means, and I think that means something different to every person. But
if I can interject here, I don't think it's about ranking the schools. It's really about understanding the types of interventions that are needed for the different types of schools.
Right.
A school that's high performing and high growth, hey, they're doing great. A school that's high performing but low growth, they need a certain type of intervention. A school that's high growth but low performing probably needs a different type of intervention. A school that's low in both categories, that's a failing school, that needs a third type of intervention. And how do we, in some way, come up with a system that, transparent to the public, dumps the schools into these 4 groups in a way that we as policymakers can then say, these are the types of interventions we recommend and we will support.
So I think, I think that is,
and that's
again, I think that is the goal here.
Ranking.
Yeah. Well, sure, yes, I think that's true. And also with the state plan comes lots of funding for interventions in the areas and places. We can talk a little bit about our vision for this, because I think our vision on this is significantly less punitive than in previous versions of federal accountability. But yeah, I do think that's exactly what our hope is, which is that with transparent reporting about the kinds of things that we are measuring, we can say, here's a, maybe there's like a 1 overall rating, maybe, but here's where your school is. Your school might have started here, but they're great at growth. And by the way, you're great at growth in these specific areas, in these types, particularly for XYZ. And so I do think that is the idea. And I think we at OSSE have certain amounts of funding to dedicate to interventions, and the LEAs themselves do most of that in and of themselves. And then of course there's always the sort of like broader policy legislative bucket. So I do think that is the goal here of this type of transparency and that type of common transparency across the whole city, which is very meaningful to families.
So that's your goal, and you believe, the superintendent believes, OSSE believes, that this is the best way to achieve that goal.
This is our shot. Yeah, this is our best shot. I mean, I think this is the point, right? We're having this conversation. We are embarking on a series of public comment, and we are still doing and will do through after the public comment and before final some more work on this. But that is the intent. Yeah.
Karen and I apologize. We have to go to another meeting.
You missed all the fun stuff.
I'm gonna trust our committee chair and now our most senior member, Ruth Wattenberg, to continue to chair this meeting.
You beat me by like 2 minutes.
And we will try and follow up on some of the notes specifically around some of the non-academic measures. I'm sorry you guys
I
weren't
appreciate
able to
that.
share
Thank you.
some of that.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I just wanna say, I just asked why was anyone saying to do it, because they swear you in order of your award and
They used to. Remember, they used to. This year they started doing a random order, right?
That was only for commissioners.
Oh, that's true.
Order, yeah, right. So we're making emergency legislation to renumber awards.
So can I ask one question?
Sure.
In regards to the configuration of percent, how much percent and weight is given, can you all just can you all run some figures for us so we see it in different ways? So it isn't split at 50-50 all the time?
So it's technically not 50-50, like just to be clear, it's 25 and then actually 55 if you factor in 3+, because it's actually not 50-50 in terms of proficiency and growth. So just mathematically, like yes, it's 40% academic achievement, 40% growth, but it's not 50-50 in terms of proficiency versus growth. Like just to be clear on what
In that 3+ is not proficiency, so it's like a
We're
little
using
bit of
that
a
in a
bump.
different way, but we're talking about having to reach an absolute threshold as opposed to growth.
Okay.
I think we have looked into some of these things. We'll continue. We're tinkering a little bit and trying to get some of the other things finalized. And I think what I shared, I think I heard very clearly what you're talking about, and I think what we shared is sort of what?
I just don't want us to fail at this. I want us to be on the map as much as we are right now for the growth that's going on in the district.
Yep.
And this is our one opportunity to do that right now. Because we can always adjust it, right? It's fluid, right? The document, we can give dates, so.
Yeah, it can be amended. Understood.
I think we're gonna really need to see the modeling and see how these hypothetical schools fall. I mean, I just think it's really important to understand that we can't vote on this without understanding how, for example, a low scoring school that grows well, what's gonna happen to it? I mean, I just don't see how we can vote without that being transparent to us. So I just wanna say that. I know you're running these models, and at some point we just need to look at it.
And we all have kind of different perceptions of what a high growth, high achieving school is, and there's going to be some negotiation as to how we would classify those. But to our constituents, we have to say this passes the smell test of how the public would evaluate or rank or think about this school. So having some sort of data behind it that we can use to justify that decision would be helpful.
Thank you, and you can, using my power to chair, we can go on. Felt so good.
I get it.
Okay, so there's a large bucket of sort of non-academic questions in here. And I will start not in order of importance, but in order of answerability perhaps. So one of the questions asked was about re-enrollment rate, and the way that it works a little bit and how, and mid-year withdrawal and some of the, I just wanted to share a little bit of that technical update. So Re-enrollment rate is, in the current methodology, is measured enrollment to enrollment audit date. And it is, and it does.
Say that again, sorry.
So it's based on the enrollment audit year over year of the school. And we have done work with data and with those sectors in modeling it. It is not disproportionately affecting different sectors. Both sectors in the past have used very similar metrics in their own sort of internal and external accountability work. Because it does measure a static date, it is not a measure of mobility. So it does not take into account one way or the other mid-year mobility. And so I just wanted to be clear about that, because there's a lot of work being done in the city right now about mobility and enrollment in a lot of different ways. But this does not, that's not what this does measure. So I just wanted to give that like broad update. This is like one of the smaller measures in our framework, and it is designed to show a limited. It is limited in what it shows. This is designed to be a measure of families who are there in one audit who choose and can re-enroll, and it does have controls for things like terminal grades and things like that. So you're not going to be dinged because you're graduating or you're final year. So I just wanted to share that. There's a broader question about a
The mid-year mobility is not being counted because you also don't necessarily assess growth and performance in the framework if they enter another school mid-year, right? So is that the rationale behind it, or does OSSE believe it's just not an accurate assessment of the schools?
Mid-year mobility, we would not consider to be a measure that we would include in accountability for a lot of the reasons you talk about, in terms of something that a school could or would be held accountable for in that sense, in terms of a mid-year. So we wouldn't, while we do lots of data and reporting on this in general, we wouldn't include it in like an accountability system for the school if a student is leaving or coming in the middle of the year. And it works differently in different of our schools versus like a by-right school and other things. So it's not one we would use for accountability. I did want to talk a little bit about like the broader question of surveys. We've had this conversation in a variety of different places and in a lot of public comment. One of the questions was, what is the value of surveys, and in what sense is there momentum publicly to get to a place where we could get schools engaged and have a common survey? So I think, like everyone else, we have great interest in survey work. And I think we are, we're doing one pilot of a school climate survey, which is probably very different. Well, to my understanding, it's somewhat different than some of the other ones being modeled for this type of thing, although it is not for accountability right now. And we have heard, as you have, a lot of the testimony for and some against use of survey in an accountability system. We think there is significant work to be done, and are not going to be presenting it as part of our framework, but that there is significant work to be done by OSSE, by the state board, by schools, by potentially public or private funding to engage schools in use of those types of surveys. And many of our schools actually do have survey instruments, which they use already, which is which many of our charter schools would remind us is part of their autonomy, and which deserve to be modeled and made public and shared in communities of practice. And so one of the things we've been thinking about largely at OSSE is around similar buckets of work in which there's a lot of school autonomy, a lot of care about these things, and a lot of need to get buy-in in order for it to work well, is around what we've practiced in the teacher evaluation space, which is our staffing collaborative, which is supported and staffed, but is opt-in by schools who want to be in a working group around teacher and educator evaluation. And they have collaborated on model systems, shared best practice, reported publicly, and helped set the standard, actually, in many cases across the city for this type of activity and behavior, and that DCPS has their own for evaluation, but many charters, need the resources to be able to do it themselves. But at that table, you have both like big and small schools and leaders of all different kinds who come together in community of practice to explore it. And we think there's a bunch of different models that we could, sort of put our money where our mouth is, so to speak, as a city, both public and private funding to seed, potentially, to seed work on things like school surveys, and also leave significant room on various kinds of school report card public reporting for optional reporting of those things that brings momentum to the use of measures like that. There's a couple of different reasons that we didn't include it, but I think that gaining momentum from schools who can and would use things and test them and prove their merit is a strong way to move forward for us to get buy-in across the schools and the families and the communities who might find it helpful, and to do some of that piloting and testing. I hear maybe Laura on the phone rumbling.
Laura, do you want to say something? Or anybody on the phone want to say anything?
No, sorry, I thought I was still muted. No, this is just me trying to breathe.
Oh, no.
My question is to the surveys, and it's a question that's come up a couple times posed to me, is how can we ensure that the data collected is accurate and reliable, and what are we going to do to make these surveys, what happens when we send it out and only 3, come back? Is there going to be measures in place to make it required, and then what do we do to make that, if the surveys that come back, that data accurate?
This is actually one of our concerns. This is one of the concerns, and it's partnered with another concern. It's a significant logistical hurdle to implement complex surveys or multi-part surveys across schools, particularly across schools with different levels of ability to access those surveys many times. And there may well be situations in which schools are disadvantaged one way or the other because of the participation or ability, both participation and ability to participate in surveys like that. We're not saying that would never be possible. We just don't feel comfortable that it's been proven enough for us to put it in for points on a system. And so similarly, we would love to model it and pilot it and leave space to report it and see how it went and felt. But I think that is one of our concerns, is that particularly for multi-part surveys, the level of response, the ability of certain communities to have access and to respond is varied. And then secondly, for things like this, it's challenging to make them for accountability, because then people treat them like they're being used for accountability. So, people can potentially spend an inordinate amount of time trying to get responses, trying to get a certain kind of responses, coaching around responses when it's for accountability than when it's just collected. And so I think that's pinpointed one of our key concerns.
In terms of school climate and environment, have we thought, and I know that OSSE has invested some dollars in this over the past few years, have we thought about using community school programming as a performance metric? I think we all know that community school programming improves outcomes, increases parent engagement, brings truancy down. If schools are doing that work, right? Stanton is one of your grantees, right? Park scores are coming up, truancy's coming down, right? Outcomes are improving. Other than obviously the growth that we're seeing, which is already measured in this framework, just the fact that they're doing that, right? Is there, I guess, what are your thoughts on using that as a metric?
I think broadly, we wanna find ways to highlight it, but probably not in an accountability system for points. There's a bunch of technical reasons, like we're required by law to have the metrics we have be usable across all schools. And so, while it's certainly like important to be able to report on efforts like this that are making a difference, and like I've seen in lots of places where like school report cards have reserved spaces that schools can highlight, like efforts and other like activities that are making like what is your school story, what are you doing to make a difference, like what things are meaningful to you, what are your values. That is probably, I think, a better place to put that, to highlight it. And what's like amazing and also unfortunate is like there's so many stories like that in our schools where like amazing things are happening, and I don't think we'd be able to, we wouldn't and probably wouldn't want to, because of, you don't want to incentivize the wrong thing, be able to accommodate it in the accountability system for points. But there's got to be a way to like share more of the good stuff that matters to families who are coming into these schools, to say like, well, like what is here for me? What's the good word? Like what is exciting here? And so that's also just part of like our challenge of how we make this broader reporting system meaningful to people. And I don't think we've fully answered that, but I think that's one example of something that maybe could be considered.
And just a follow up to that, I think, are your thoughts similar with like the blended learning and all of that stuff?
Yeah, well, there's another question in here specifically, and I don't know if Ruth's about to ask it or not, because I saw your hand go up about like different kinds of measures that are like the Fordham reference, one of you could.
Yeah.
And so I was about to talk about that because there's
Before you do, can I follow up on Marcus's, which is, so next year when you have this, we're talking about the report cards, which we're not now. It seems to me to be possible not just to say, oh, give each school an opportunity to say what great thing it has, but specifically to ask, do you to what extent do you provide psychological services? To what extent do you provide, on-site physician services or dental services or whatever the list is, so you could really see that it is something very important and that it would be visible.
I agree, and I'm sort of like excited about this. I think visually, so like, and similarly with my own kids, right? Like you want to think about all the cool stuff that goes in that is important, that makes your school individually fun and helpful and interesting. And so like, yeah, we should probably like have the report card with the numbers and a lot of meaningful information that's easy, but we should probably have like a little like whole child flower with like, okay, like what's dual language, what's community schools, like how much exercise and gym and fun activity stuff is there, like what about arts, like what about music, what about civics, like, what are those things that we are displaying in a way that is actually showing it, and not just like, here's a paragraph that you can read through, like maybe if you can find the right word.
Well, and I'd go one step further, something that's somewhat objective. When the schools rate themselves,
Yes.
they sound beautiful. Trust me, I've written many for several of the schools of the neighborhood. It's all about marketing at that point. Where can we get to an objective measure of what's in the schools?
And I think the things he's raising in the community schools are just super important. So just as we go forward to that.
Yeah, and maybe it's just as simple as saying these are the students we've identified with certain needs. These are how many students have gotten those needs met by the end of the school year, right? I don't know if this was brought up, but student to teacher ratio, has that been thought about?
We wouldn't use it for accountability, but that's probably something we would, certainly put on like a sort of a school profile.
It could go in the report card. Especially the resource as part of the report card.
Yeah, I think so.
Which unfortunately we can't really discuss.
So I wanted to talk about the question that was put here, which is about one of the submissions to the Fordham Institute in a template accountability proposal early on, which was talking about giving formula award points to schools for access to different parts of the curriculum or other things that are valued in the school. And this is something actually that we have been considering, had looked into. We actually talked to them directly about it. The first thing they said was, what we submitted isn't valid under the law anymore. We were wrong. We're like, well, that's not helpful. Keep talking. talking. Because at the time, the specific example that they put up was really like a pick one option. And that's not allowable under the law. You have to have the same, schools have to be measured against the same thing. So you can't like choose music or art or PE or something else. And we have done some examination of metrics like this that could be organized in other ways. And we hit up against the same pros and cons challenges. So I don't think, so we're still sort of examining and looking into some of this. But first is the ability to collect it by the schools in the level of detail and verifiability that you would need when you start putting something in a system and send it to the state and like calculate it and disaggregate it by grade, by
So I'm just saying, for
subgroup.
those who didn't read this specific
Oh, I'm
question,
sorry, you want me to summarize here?
it's about awarding points, especially for elementary schools that spend a minimum amount of time on social studies, science, and perhaps the arts.
Arts,
That's good
music,
area.
language, you know, PE minutes or something like that, yeah. I mean, so these are places in which I think we'd be interested in it, in theory, but we hit up some really tough logistical problems in looking at if it's possible. Because if you want to report it, you probably have to report out on all of those things.
No.
But, well, or whichever ones you chose, you have to report on it across all students, and then by grade, by subgroup, by a bunch of other different sort of like business rules, which make it really, really challenging and burdensome to collect and time consuming to collect for schools. If we could get to a point that a metric like that could work, which we still haven't quite figured out if there's a way, that also would not disadvantage some schools, right? Because, you know, this is again where like some schools are much more resourced to be able to provide things and some aren't. So like on one hand, it's really important to highlight and shine a light so that people can fix things, but on the other hand, there may well be very like strong inequities about, and so if you're giving points for it, like this is where like it might be beneficial to have some reporting but not for points.
But even if you're giving points or not, at that point, you're failing because you're not receiving those points. That is a target for an intervention, and we need to find those resources, whether they're through OSSE or through public advocacy or DCPS or the council to invest in that school.
Yeah.
I think there's something to be said for developing a measure that holds schools accountable for student growth, but also holds LEAs accountable for ensuring a wide array of programming and the options that students need to grow. You can sit and drill students all you want and they'll test great. Are those students well-rounded? Are they going to do well in the workplace? I would argue no, and I think my constituents would argue no. They want robotics, rocketry, debate, and those types of things. And if they're not the school may test well. It may be high growth, high achievement. That's still not a school that I want to send my daughter to.
Can I use this just to ask a broader question, which is, under the old No Child Left Behind, the state held LEAs accountable, potentially for the kinds of things that Joe's raising and that Marcus has raised. And then the LEA and the state held the school responsible. So we've only been talking about holding the schools accountable, the rating for that. What is the plan for how the state holds the LEAs accountable? You were just sort of saying there is something going on that. How is that going to play out? So what is the law require and what's your intention on that? Because it does raise these.
That's how you get to the inequities.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to know it's there, but if you don't, someone doesn't identify it, you can't move forward.
Exactly.
So that's how you can have a high performing school, and then you have the children not moving up because there may be a high performing school, but they may not have the funds to help those children move up because that chess program, oh wow, it's not right here where I'm living in Ward 8. It might can't drive me all the way on the other side of the city. You see, those kind of things are real.
Yeah.
And so, how can this document allow us to get at, identifying where more resources will be needed as well? I mean, how can we, yes, I want it to be a voice for families. I want families to be able to look at it and say, oh, I want to send my child here, or this works for us or not work for us. But I also want to know that where they may not have an understanding of the education system that we do right here. And in our understanding, we understand that we have to make sure that it's equitable everywhere in the city. And if it's not, we need to have a way to make sure that we can get the money to that school or the resources to that school. I can go to Capitol Hill and there's a school that I was working at, they had an ice skate rink. Children ice skating outside. You know, that was part of it. That's beautiful. I'm glad to see that because the children in that particular school had an opportunity to have that exposure. Probably never had one. But does that not mean that the children in Ward 8 not have the same ability to have that? That was because they had a wonderful vehicle. They could afford it. I think that's wonderful. But I do believe it goes both ways, that we have to be able to identify that within a document. This is our opportunity to have a document that's going to be useful for us across that, way. So you just don't want to give them a grade. You want to know that whatever grade, how can we help you get the A?
Yes, I don't know.
So the question is, what is the proposal for how the state is gonna hold the LEAs responsible for providing the infrastructure, the resources that are necessary?
So I think we have, the framework of the state plan to share the information we have about schools in a public way. And we have interventions for the schools that are struggling the most and struggling with specific groups of students. And we have ways to recognize schools that are doing great work. Like you said, OSSE is a policy-making body, and we have lots of other work streams, as you know, every day that go around this work. I think I can get back with a little bit more clarity. I mean, largely these interventions are to schools, and then schools have plans to improve and have plans to implement the laws and the other provisions of the plan as needed. And then it's about, using the information and the things that we make public on hand to continue that conversation in a way that is meaningful with our communities and with schools and with, other policymakers, I think. I mean, I think those are the right conversations. I don't think it all ends up on one page in one plan with one number. That's a much bigger conversation about the things that we want to advance and move forward. And I think it has to happen, not just in any given ESSA plan or in any given metric, candidly.
Can I just, and my thoughts are kind of meandering around in my head, so I apologize, but have we thought about giving extra points to schools who attain a certain level of growth or proficiency or any other metric, but a certain level of improvement if that school is, for instance, a 40-40 school, right? So if you post a certain amount of growth and you're a 40-40 school and you post a certain amount of growth and you're not, why can't that growth be counted a little more if you're working harder to? And I think it goes a little bit to the point of where Ruth is, but the fact that the system is already identified, right, our lowest performing schools in the city, and we know that the staff there has a lot of work to do. And why can't we give those schools extra points for the tremendous progress they're making, right? Because we already have that pot. Why,
I think would hope that it would be accounted for in the system as is to start. I think there's other mechanisms at our disposal in terms of some of the flexibility we have for recognizing schools, the highest performing and or highest growing schools. I'm less familiar about the actual details behind it, but I think we have some flexibility there to say, how are we using these methods of recognition and reward to highlight those schools, and what other resources can we put behind that?
One slight pushback, we've identified the 40 lowest performing within DCPS, not across both sectors, and I think we can okay with that. Right. I would caution, I love the idea of some sort of, gold group and silver star, whatever we want to do for a school that's doing exactly that. But I don't know if I would want to give them extra points, because it could bump them out of the category and mean they're ineligible for resources that could help continue. So I think we're right, we want to recognize, but in some ways we want them to stay in those categories so they get the resources they need to continue that progress. So I think there's some sort of balance there.
I agree. Thank you.
You guys need to.
Well, we don't need to leave right now, but there's a couple of other slides we could get to, but if not, we can get to them another time. We'll make sure we're being responsive.
We just wanted to make sure the other pieces of, there's a couple of small updates that we wanted to make sure you staff it.
Well, so let me suggest this. Let's see if there's another quick round of questions, and then I know you want to show us these new things that are happening. And then I just want to say, we really appreciate answering some of these questions. There's still a bunch of questions put forward that aren't answered, so we still need to figure out how we're going to get them answered.
Okay, well, I'm happy to work with John Paul if you highlight which ones specifically. I feel like we tried to bucket very closely some of the content, and it's, instead
a lot of it
one by one.
Frankly, a lot of it is going to get to being able to literally see that if you have sort of being able to see that if you have a school that's has mainly low scoring kids. You say there's lots of examples when you say there are these schools that have mainly enrolled low scoring students, and then they're able to hit these great milestones. And I just want to see what happens if you have a school that's mainly full of, enrolls students are in 1s and 2s. How, if those 1s go to high 1s or 2s, or the 2s go to high 2s and they don't hit 3s, but that's huge growth, like it's substantially above the MGP, where are they going to fall in your tiers? And I just think we need to kind of know that answer, because if they're not going to if they're going to be put in a category that's going to make it sound like they're failing, speaking for me, and I think for most of us, just based on my conversation, that's not going to work. And so we just need to see it. Some of this is, we can argue on the principle, and at some points, we can all kind of agree at some level on the principle. We got to sort of see where these schools are going to go. And there's other questions as well, but I think that's a good one.
And if I can add, I'd love to sit down for another hour or 2 hour session where we're looking at data plugged into a model and see where it comes out, and if it's something that we can use to say, yes, this makes sense, and really see the examples. The other thing I would say, I get exactly where you're at with the survey. I still know that my constituents want the survey in some way included. So what's the path forward? And coming to a clear answer that maybe it's not included in year 1, but do we have a more concrete proposal for how do we do this in future years? What's the timeline for that? I know you're talking about modeling some of the surveys that chapters have done, or charters have done, or DCPS has done. I don't like their survey at all. But there are other proven metrics out there, including some done by the U.S. Department of Ed. So how can we come to a path forward there? I'm not comfortable going to my constituents and saying, yeah, OSSE's explanation is good, it's off the table. I don't think that's the right path forward.
Like a commitment to reopen this in 1 year. Meanwhile, there's a task force, cross-sector, cross-stakeholder, to really figure out how do we do this. And we know that we're going to sit back down, and task force starts immediately. We're going to have answers by next December or next February, whatever.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. We can think about what might make sense.
Let's come to an agreement on what that path is.
We can think about what we would want to, propose in terms of how our stakeholder would be, if interested in moving forward and what we think is possible and likely in terms of engaging, I mean, for, both for reporting and for anything else.
I was gonna say, I think, I agree with your original assessment that I think, the lines of work when you do a survey is solely based on accountability, and some schools or LEAs will try to do certain things to, elicit a certain response, but I think it's my opinion that they should be doing those things to try to elicit a certain response, right? I think if families think one way, right, and if, there is being presented, by the schools that way, I think then everybody wins, and so, I get that, and I know that there's a certain level of subjectivity, that goes into it, and sometimes school communities, can alter, the dynamic of the school community can alter responses, but I agree that I think if we can assess in years moving forward how we make it work, and how we make it, not completely foolproof, but at least something that we think is reliable, Yeah, I think that.
All right, you wanna go to the next things and?
Yeah, we don't have a ton of time. No, I mean, I
You
think.
just throw them out and you won't even
Yeah,
ask
or-
questions or?
Well, yeah, either we can go through high level, or you can take a look at the documents sent to you. It just depends how much stamina you feel like you have.
Is this what you're gonna show us on Wednesday night or this?
No,
Okay.
this is just like a couple other updates about.
Yeah, and I can send it, so the presentation is on Assembly, and I can send it out as well.
So it's up to you, if you guys need to go, we are not holding hostage.
I'm just trying to think, like,
The
in.
one, I think the one on slide 18 is probably.
Yeah, let's
more-
start with just a couple of the short ones, if we can work our way back from there, I think.
Yeah, so one, discrete update that we're proposing in, the system is within the English language proficiency domain. As you may remember, what you're seeing on the left here is what we had last talked about. So in all of the frameworks, there's English language proficiency. We had proposed a breakdown of access growth, being half the points, and access proficiency at the level of 5 and above being the other half of the points. And as we did, some further modeling on this, we realized that the way we had set it up might be problematic, because unlike an assessment that's framed around college and career readiness, access is a different kind of test. And so access is really measuring how well students are acquiring language. And once a student hits level 5, like, they're at language acquisition, versus something like college and career readiness, where once a student hits level 4, we want them to stay there and to continue to perform at that level. And so we realized that by having a measure that was broken down in this way, it didn't quite get at the fact that access is really looking at a snapshot of a student's current level of proficiency. And while we certainly want students to exit, it's important to consider that student's individual trajectory and to measure success when students make progress towards exiting EL status. And we know that the distribution of our students who are at the cusp of being able to reach that level is very different. And so a measure that assesses sort of a student's starting point and how well they are moving towards that exit status is more meaningful in telling us how our students are doing in English language proficiency, which is what this domain has been inserted into the system to assess. And so we're now proposing to do this entire domain solely based on growth. So the overall points haven't changed, but just that it would look at growth only rather than growth and students scoring at the 5 and above level. So,
Yeah, I think it might make sense to send around some of the other stuff, and if we need other times to chat about it, then we can do that at the work session or otherwise.
Great.
We'll try and make what we can work between now and then, if that works, just given the time.
And let me just say, I speaking for all of us, we really appreciate the, getting this, and I just hope you understand our, I don't want to be deadline, and there's just a lot of stuff that we need to know, so that's why we're going through counting the lines, because, we need sort of some movement on this as well as some answers, so that's why we're here.
Thanks for looking.
Today was very helpful.
Great, well, we're also there's more content in what we sent before, I think it made sense given the time, to let you guys take a look, and we'll come back and, find if we need time to take a look at that and see where we go from there. We'll have other updates on other outreach and other work from there as we go. That works. Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Real quick before we go, another Ward 6 meeting outside of CHIPSA, Capital Bill Arts, what job, another the number 6 one, workshop, we love the host one.
Oh.
So we've got a good location. I'm pretty flexible on dates, if you want to give me 2 or 3 dates that work for you, I'll consider my schedule. Set it up with that.
Okay.
Great, yeah, I'll follow through.
Perfect.